certainly something that the U.S. government officials and the president would want to be concerned about?
Yes.
And if a foreign country has a problem with oligarchs taking money, taking U.S. taxpayer dollars, that's something that the president ought to be concerned about in advance of dispensing the aid?
Yes.
And I believe you did testify that corruption is endemic in Ukraine?
Correct.
Are you also aware of the president's skepticism of foreign aid generally?
I am.
And it's something that he's made part of his priorities to make sure that U.S. foreign aid is spent wisely?
That is correct.
And you're also aware the president has concerns about burden sharing among our allies?
Yes.
And with respect to Ukraine, he was very interested and engaged in seeing if there was a possibility for our European allies to step up and contribute more?
Yes, I think that would be in the context of military assistance. In terms of burden sharing, the European Union provides over $15 billion.
Okay.
Has provided since 2014.
Okay, but you are aware of the president's concern of burden sharing, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Turning our attention specifically to the company Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky, the co-founder of Burisma, it's one of Ukraine's largest natural gas producers, correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
And it's been subject to numerous investigations over the years.
I'm not aware of, I guess I couldn't point to specific investigations, but there is a what I would call a pattern of questionable dealings and questions about corruption.
Zlochevsky had served as the Minister of Ecology during President Yanukovych's tenure.
I came to learn that is correct, yes.
And are you aware, and George Kent testified a little bit about this last week, that under the Obama administration, the U.S. government encouraged Ukraine to investigate whether Zlochevsky used his government position to grant himself or Burisma exploration licenses. Are you aware of that?
I would defer to George Kent. He's a fount of knowledge on Ukraine, much deeper knowledge than I have. And if he attested to that, then I'd take his word for it.
And he testified that the U.S., along with the United Kingdom, was engaged in trying to recoup about $23 million in taxpayer dollars from Zlochevsky and the Burisma entity.
I understand he testified that, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Kent also testified that the investigation was moving along, and then all of a sudden there was a bribe paid, and the investigation went away. Did you hear him mention that?
I heard him mention that. These are events that occurred before my time, so frankly, beyond what he said, I don't know much more.
Fair enough. Right around the time the bribe was paid, the company sought to bolster their board. Are you aware that they tapped some luminaries for their corporate board?
Certainly, I learned that at some point, yes.
Including the president of Poland, I believe?
Yes.
And Hunter Biden?
Yes, I came to learn that as well.
And are you aware of any specific experience Hunter Biden has in the Ukrainian corporate governance world?
I don't know much about Mr. Hunter Biden.
And we talked a little bit about, at your deposition, about whether Mr. Biden was qualified to serve on this board. And you know, I believe you acknowledged that apparently he was not, in fact, qualified?
As far as I can tell, he didn't seem to be, but like I said, I don't know his qualifications.
Okay. Ms. Williams, I want to turn our attention to the inaugural trip. At one point, the vice president and the vice president's office was focusing on attending that, correct?
That's right.
And it's somewhat complicated because, as I understand it, the White House doesn't want the president and the vice president to be out of the country at the same time.
Yes, that's correct.
And during the time frame, the president was in Japan. I believe he was in Japan May 24th to 28th. And then he returned to Europe for the D-Day ceremonies, June 2nd to 7th. And I think you told us that there was a window you provided of 4 days at the end of May, that if the vice president was going to attend the inauguration, it had to be the 29th, 30th, 31st, or 1st?
Our embassy in Kyiv had been in discussions with the with President Zelensky's team. And as we had learned, obviously the Ukrainian parliament was not going to come back into session until mid-May, and so we wouldn't know formally what the date would be. But we understood that the initial thinking was that they were looking at dates at the end of May, and so honing in on that time frame, we were aware of President Trump's plan to travel on either end, and so that's why we advised the Ukrainians that if Vice President Pence were to be able to participate, the only really available days would be May 30th, May 31st, or June 1st.
Okay. And before the vice president travels to a foreign nation, you have to send the Secret Service, do advance work, book hotels, and it's a relatively involved preparation experience, right?
That's correct.
And do you know if the Secret Service ever deployed, booked hotels or anything of that sort?
My understanding is that our advance team was looking into those preparations, including hotel availability, and we were trying to determine when it would be appropriate to send out Secret Service and other advanced personnel in order to lay groundwork for a trip. But because we weren't sure yet when the date would be, we hesitated to send those officials out.
But ultimately, the Secret Service, as I understand it, did not deploy.
I don't believe they did, no.
Okay. And the President Zelensky's inauguration was May 20th, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, that's correct.
And you had about 4 days' notice?
In the end, the Ukrainian parliament decided on May 16th to set the date for May 20th. That's correct.
So you would acknowledge that made it quite difficult for the vice president and the whole operation to mobilize and get over to Ukraine, correct?
It would have been, but we had already stopped the trip planning by that point.
And when did that happen?
Stopping the trip planning?
Yeah.
On May 13th.
Okay. And how did you hear about that?
I was called by a colleague in the vice president's chief of staff's office and told to stop the trip planning.
Okay, and as I understand it, it was the assistant to the chief of staff?
That's correct.
Okay, and so you didn't hear about it from General Kellogg or the chief of staff or...
Correct.
Or the president or the vice president? You,
right.
You heard about it from Mr. Short's assistant?
That's right.
And did you have any knowledge of the reasoning for stopping the trip?
I asked my colleague why we should stop trip planning and why the vice president would not be attending, and I was informed that the president had decided the vice president would not attend the inauguration.
Okay, but do you know why the president decided?
No, she did not have that information.
Okay. And ultimately, the vice president went to Canada for a USMCA event.
That's right.
During this this window of time, correct?
Correct.
So it's entirely conceivable that the president decided that he wanted the vice president to go to Canada on behalf of USMCA instead of doing anything else, correct?
I'm really not in a position to speculate what the motivations were behind the president's decision.
Well, you know, the vice president's done quite a bit of USMCA events, correct?
Absolutely. Yes,
okay.
sir.
And are you aware of whether anyone at the State Department inquired with your office about the vice president's availability for the trip to Canada?
For the trip, at what point?
Early May, maybe May 8th.
I was not involved in the trip planning for Canada. Mm-hmm. One of my colleagues who covers Western Hemisphere was in charge of that, so I'm not aware of specific requests about the vice president's availability. I was aware from my colleague who was planning that trip that we had competing trips potentially for the same window, but I was told that the Ukraine trip would take priority.
Okay, but ultimately you don't know.
I don't know about the Canada trip? Or?
You don't know the reason as to why the vice president was sent to Canada for a USMCA event instead of going to the Ukraine?
I would say I don't know the reason behind why the president directed the vice president not to go to Ukraine. I can't speak to the motivations or about the Canada trip.
Okay. Colonel Vindman, I'd like to turn a little bit to the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office and the subsequent post-meeting in the wardroom. Who all was in the July 10th meeting, to the best of your recollection?
Are we talking about the boardroom, or are we talking about the actual meeting with Ambassador Bolton?
We'll start with the first meeting in the ambassador's office.
So from the U.S. side, we had Ambassador Bolton, Dr. Hill. I believe there was another a special assistant to the president, Wells Griffith, was in there. Mm-hmm. And myself from the Ukrainians.
From the Ukrainians. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, for the Ukrainian side, we had Alexander Daniluk, Andriy Yermak, and I think Alexander Danyaluk's advisor, Alexei Semeny.
Okay. And you testified that you couldn't recall exactly why Ambassador Bolton stopped the meeting short, and you only learned it subsequently when talking to Dr. Fiona Hill?
Yeah, I noted that it ended abruptly, but I didn't, frankly, I didn't exactly know why.
And in the Bolton meeting, you don't remember Ambassador Sondland using the word Biden?
He did not.
Okay.
To the best of my recollection, I don't think he did.
And then the group decamped to take a photo, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the general feeling of the group was a positive one at that time, even though it may have ended abruptly.
I think Ambassador Bolton was exceptionally qualified. He understood the strategic communications opportunity of having a photo, and we prompted him to before we completely adjourned to see if he was willing to do a photo, and he did.
Okay, so you went out to West Executive Ave or wherever in the White House and you took a photo. I think you said you took it?
I certainly took a couple of them, yes.
Okay. And in the photo was Secretary Perry, Ambassador Bolton, Ambassador Volker,
That's right. Yeah.
Mr. Daniluk, and Mr. Yarmark?
Yes, and I apologize. When I was running through the U.S. side, of course, Ambassador Bolton, Volker, and Sondland were there, and Secretary Perry was there.
Okay. Now, you testified that before the July 10th meeting, you had developed concerns about the narrative, involving Rudy Giuliani. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And had you heard like a firsthand account from anyone on the inside, or had you just been following news accounts?
So I certainly was following news accounts, and that's from the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian press, and U.S. press.
Okay.
And my colleagues in the interagency also were concerned about this, as this had started in the March timeframe, kind of emanating from the John Solomon story all the way through. So there had been ongoing conversations, so several different sources. Counsel.
Okay. And so when Ambassador Sondland mentioned the investigations, you sort of had a little bit of a clue of what the issue was?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. And then you took the photo, very nice photo, and then you went to the wardroom?
Correct.
And do you remember, I think you conceded to us that you had a hard time remembering exactly what was said in the wardroom. Again, it's 4 months ago. It's hard to be precise about whether Sondland, what specific words he used, whether he used Burisma, 2016 investigations.
Yeah, so I believe it's in the deposition, the three elements, Burisma, Biden's, and the 2016 elections were all mentioned.
In the wardroom?
Correct.
I think we can maybe go back to this, but I think on page 64 of your testimony, you told us that you don't remember him using 2016 in the wardroom.
I believe that I actually followed up, and because this question was asked multiple times, I said that all three elements were in there. So
okay, so
picked out
when we asked the question, it sort of refreshed your recollection.
Yes, I guess that's a term now.
There was some discussion of, whether when Mr. Morrison took over the portfolio for Dr. Hill, whether you were sidelined at all. Did you feel like you were?
So I certainly was excluded or didn't participate in the trip to Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus at the end of August. And I wasn't initially, before it changed from a POTUS trip to a vice president trip to Warsaw, I wasn't participating in that one. So I didn't miss that, no.
Did you express any concerns to Mr. Morrison about why you weren't included on those trips?
So Mr. Morrison, I was on leave. I was supposed to be on leave from the 3rd of August through about the 16th or so of August, and he called me and asked me to return. There was obviously high priority travel to the region. He needed my assistance to help plan for it, and in asking me to return early from leave, which I take infrequently, I assumed that I'd be going on the trip. So when I was after returning from leave early, when I was told I wasn't going, I inquired